I got the invitation to go on this Armed Lutheran radio show, though. You know this guy? Have you seen this? There's two things that I would like to say that make me feel safe. Number one, the fact that there is a radio show called the Armed Lutheran Podcast somewhere in the world. That makes me feel safe.
Pistols, prayer, and potluck. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 402. Thank you all so much for making Armed Lutheran Radio a part of your week again this week. Welcome one and all. Glad to have you with us. If you are new, hope you will peruse the back catalog, come back for more in the future. We just, a couple of weeks ago, passed 400 episodes. If you throw in the midweek meditations that I did back in the day, we're probably closer to 425 at this point, but who's counting? In any event, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for checking us out. Hope you will stick around for more. Today we're talking about some a little odd topic, a little off the beaten path, but I thought it was interesting. Something that I think has an important relation to the gun debate, and it may sound crazy. We'll get there in a minute. You'll understand as we go. We're talking about new music, the Fallout game universe again. Trust me, you'll understand shortly. And a social experiment that was conducted back in the 1960s that I think bears discussing. But first, I want to thank the members of the Reformation Gun Club, the men and women who make this show possible. Good folks like Melvin from Holt, Missouri, the disreputable Bartlett, Robert from Monroe, Georgia, Keith from Palmyra, Missouri, Luke from Seymour, Indiana, Jerry and Billy from Deer Lodge, Montana, Donnie from White Bear Lake, Minnesota, Mark from Lake Havasu City, Arizona, and Paul from McKinney, Texas. Thank you all so much, and thank you to all of the Reformation Gun Club members for your support. Armed Lutheran Radio is listener-funded. That means we don't have any advertising. You're not going to hear any sponsored ads here on the show or any commercials. We rely on the members of the Reformation Gun Club and their annual contributions to help keep things going. If you would like to find out more about the Reformation Gun Club and take advantage of all the benefits that it offers, check out reformationgunclub.com. You'll get access to hundreds of hours of exclusive content, some cool Armed Lutheran swag, invitations to our monthly online hangouts like the one you heard at episode 400 a couple of weeks ago, and the warm and fuzzy feeling that comes from knowing that you helped make all of this nonsense happen. So check it out again, reformationgunclub.com, or look for a link in the show notes for this or any of our previous episodes. Okay, I'm sure many of you are like, all right, what are you on about today, Lloyd? Why is this Fallout thing coming back up? So for those of you who missed it, back in episode 399, I reviewed the new Fallout TV show, shared some self-defense and personal protection lessons that I had drawn from the show. And as you know from that episode, I am a big fan of games like Fallout, big fan of the Fallout universe. At least 3 of the last 4 games, the good ones that are the sort of later, newer generation console games, Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 4. And last week, I stumbled upon a video by someone I think, if you're a fan of these kinds of games, you might want to check out. His name is Oxhorn, and like I say, if you're a gamer, you should check out his channel. It's really good stuff. He's eccentric and fun, and really, I like his live streams too. Sometimes when he plays the games and you play along with him, and he answers listener questions and enjoys a good cigar and a nice adult beverage as well. But one of the things that he's particularly good at is delving into the lore behind video games, picking out the little Easter eggs and the hidden little details that a lot of players might miss. And he's done a bunch about the Fallout universe. And the one I stumbled on last week was about the lore of Vault 11 from the New Vegas game. And I remembered that quest, but I didn't remember the details. And I did not realize that it was based on an actual series of events, something that happened in the 1960s called the Milgram Experiments. The lore behind Vault 11 and what I found so intriguing here, the lore behind all of the vaults, is this company that created them called Vault Tech. And the story is that they used some of the vaults that they created to do experiments. Some were used to test the use of, for example, to test the use of robots as overlords to see how robots and humans work together or not, as was often the case. Some were intended to test, say, the long-term exposure of humans to low levels of radiation or to different kinds of psychotropic drugs. Some were used to test what they called the forced evolutionary virus, or FEV, which at the time before the bombs dropped was an experiment to try to create a super soldier. Think Captain America. Instead, it ended up creating a bunch of super-powered mutants. So there were all kinds of... Each of the vaults is different in the game, and each one had a different purpose. Well, Vault 11, the experiment was... You might consider it more sinister and sadistic. The inhabitants of the vault were told that if they did not choose and sacrifice one person each year to be killed, the computer that controlled the vault would shut the whole thing down, turn off all life support, and everyone in the vault would die. So rather than object, they held elections. And they elected an overseer each year to act as essentially president of the vault for 1 year. And at the end of their term, that person would be the sacrifice. And this led to some weird backward campaigning in the vault. And when you enter the vault in the game, you find all these campaign posters where the candidates are basically trying to convince you not to vote for them. And you discover some evidence of corruption and coercion among the vault inhabitants, which ultimately led to murder and rebellion and mass death. And by the end of the experiment, and if you count up the number of bodies in the execution chamber, there's 18. So you can assume that this experiment only lasted for 18 years. After the bombs dropped. But at that point, there's only 5 people left. And at that point, they decide they don't care anymore, and they refuse to obey. And when they do, instead of being terminated, instead of having everything shut down and starve to death, the computer congratulates them. They weren't going to die. It was never the plan to starve all the members of the vault. It was a social experiment to see how long it would take for people to say no. And it's a really powerful story if you take the time to dig into those and dig into the details and read things that you pick up and look at all the detailed information that's left, all the stuff that's left behind, instead of just focusing solely on the mission itself. If you get into that lore, and it's what I love about these kinds of games, the detail that's put into them, the and the powerful stories that some of these games can create. And it turns out, and I didn't realize this at the time, that the experiment that they conducted in Vault 11 in that game is not just a work of fiction. In 1961, a social scientist by the name of Stanley Milgram began recruiting people to participate in a study that he said was going to be focused on memory and learning. And the volunteers were told that they would be testing the effect of punishment on learning. In reality, what they were doing was conducting an experiment on obedience to authority. The volunteers were told that they would be either in the role of teacher or student, essentially, with the teacher given the power to administer electric shocks to the student in another room if the student failed to answer questions correctly. Now, as it turned out, and the teachers did not know this, the teachers were really the only volunteers. The students were actors. Now, they were told that the shocks were there were 30 different increments starting at 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts. And each button was labeled like slight shock, danger, severe shock, and the very last one at 450 volts had a very ominous 3 red X's above the button. And in the first experiment, the student was out of sight. The teacher could not see the student. And so a series of pre-recorded responses to the shocks were played back to the teacher. And those ranged from, grunts and ooh and and to screams, and then pleading for them to stop, claims that they had a heart condition, trying to, talk their way out of continuing, and eventually dead silence. Now, an administrator who was the authority figure in this experiment would be in the room with the teacher and would encourage the teacher to continue to shock the learner, telling them that the experiment had to continue. They could not stop. They needed to continue. They couldn't do the experiment unless they pushed the button. And despite whatever the feedback, the auditory feedback they were getting, the screams or the yells or the pleading that they were hearing back from the other room, the administrator continued to tell the teacher to continue. And there was a disturbingly high number of teachers willing to proceed all the way to the maximum voltage level, the one marked XXX. Despite the pleas of the student and the supposed danger of administering 450 volts. Interestingly, and this kind of ties into what's going on in the world right now too, Stanley Milgram was a Jew, and his experiment was shaped by the not-so-distant history of the Holocaust. This is 1960. This is only 15 years past the end of World War II. Stanley Milgram believed that Americans, with our rugged sense of individualism and our self-reliant spirit, we would be different from Germans in our willingness to obey authority when it came to hurting other people. He assumed that no more than 3% of the subjects would be willing to administer the maximum shock level. He estimated 1 to 3%. Anybody want to guess how many actually did? Try 65%. 65% of the people in this study were willing to administer 450 volts of shock to someone simply because they answered a question incorrectly and because an authority figure told them that they needed to do it. 80% of those in the study were willing to continue above 150 volts. And that's the point at which the teacher would hear screaming back from the student. Now, in a variant of the experiment, teachers were allowed to choose the level of shock themselves instead of gradually increasing it with each wrong answer. And in that case, only about 2% were willing to use the maximum level. That indicated to Milgram that they just weren't willing to do it. They couldn't bring themselves to do it without the prompting of someone in authority. Now, there was a third variant of this experiment where they had another person, an assistant, in the room with the administrator and the teacher who would protest against continuing to shock the student. And that obviously decreased the willingness to obey because the person in the room, who the teacher felt like they had an ally. And then a final variant, they did it where the teacher could actually see the student. They were on the other side of a glass and they could actually interact with them. And that, of course, made it even less likely that the teacher would be willing to shock the student. But it's that first experiment that really stands out to me. And here's what I think we should make of this and why this whole discussion is coming up today. Milgram confirmed in this experiment, I think, that we as Americans really are not so special. Like the Germans of the Third Reich era, Americans will do some pretty awful stuff to each other if authority orders it. And we saw that during COVID. We saw government agents willing to arrest people simply for standing outside or for surfing or for going to church. We had Americans turning against each other because they were told by their government that people who weren't willing to wear a mask or who weren't willing to vax or people who wanted to go to church were willing to kill people. We saw entire countries like Australia basically turned into island prisons. And when you get down to it, this is really just a confirmation of the state of fallen man, sinful and wicked from birth. But it should be a sobering thought to all of us who love freedom. Whenever a politician says something stupid like, if you're going to fight the government, you need more than an AR-15, or you can't stop fighter jets or nuclear missiles with your AR-15, whenever we talk about gun control or whenever we protest against gun control, we tend to scoff at that kind of talk, as we should, because it's incredibly stupid. It's also worse than that. It suggests that the U.S. government would willingly use fighter jets or nukes against its own citizens simply because we believe in our right to keep and bear arms. But part of why we scoff at that idea is also the, I think, misguided belief that the military would not turn on its fellow citizens and start killing its own neighbors in support of a tyrannical government. After all, we think the military are consistently conservative and pro-gun, right? Right? Not so much. Certainly not so much anymore. Pro-lifers, conservatives, Christians, pro-gun people, small government people, they're being weeded out of the military. Our government agencies consider those kinds of people to be potential domestic terrorist threats. The new movie, I haven't seen it, and I have no intention of seeing it. This new movie called Civil War. It's gotten a lot of mixed reviews. Reviews from people that I respect are not positive. But there is one scene that I've seen in the trailers that I think it's chilling, in that even just seeing the commercial. It's this scene, you've probably seen it yourself. I know I keep saying seen a lot, but you have probably witnessed this scene on the television as part of a commercial for the movie. It is this guy in military fatigues with an AR-15 who is apparently threatening the main characters or threatening people. I'm not sure exactly who the threats are being directed at, but the people who apparently are in danger because they're scared this guy might shoot them, is they protest that, hey, we're Americans. And his response, chillingly, is, well, what kind of Americans? And from what I've seen, it looks like it might be the best scene in the movie. There I go with scene again. From what I have witnessed, from what I have observed, it looks to be the best scene in the movie, probably the best line. And I think the reason for that is that it touches on the truth. The truth that we are fracturing as a country into wondering what kind of American you are. Fracturing into these factions that don't seem to care a whole lot about each other. Not just having differences of opinions or disagreeing with one another, but actually having no care for whether or not you as a person die. And you can see that in the protests on college campuses going on across the country, where our best educated know-nothings are saying out loud things like, Zionists have no right to life. And our government agencies and our military are being told that those certain kinds of Americans, because of what they believe, are a danger to democracy. We're a nation that is drifting further and further from God, which explains, I think, part of our willingness to other different people and wish them harm. But think about this, if Milgram's experiments prove that people back in 1961, when most Americans were practicing, believing Christians, if Americans back then would, in large numbers, 65 to 80%, would be willing to harm other people simply because an authority figure told them to, how many do you think would be willing to do it today? And how many, given a gun and the badge of authority, would do worse if told by an authority figure that an ordinary American who protests at a school council meeting, or someone who prays outside of an abortion clinic, or someone who wears the American flag on their car or outside their home, that those people are a danger to the nation? There's a reason that leftists want gun control. And it has absolutely nothing to do with preventing mass shootings at schools or the kinds of shootings we see in our inner cities. It has nothing to do with saving lives. It's entirely about government control. And they want to control your ideas and promote their ideas with no possibility of pushback. And the way you do that is you take away everyone's guns. Because when push comes to shove, If citizens have no way to defend their lives, government can do what it wants. Okay, that's my thought for today. What do you think? Am I crazy here? What did you think about the music? If you've played the video game, what did you think about? Do you remember that mission from the game? If you studied psychology or sociology in college, as my wife did, do you remember the Milgram Experiment? What do you think about its application today? What does it say about America today? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please visit our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback. Leave us a voice message. Send us a message on the Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio page on Facebook, or send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. Until we get together again next week for episode 403, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback, or a review on iTunes, and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.